So, moving on to today's speaker, Professor Helen Roy. She's a British ecologist and entomologist. She's principal scientist and ecologist at NERC's Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. And her research looks at the effects of environmental change on insect populations and communities, with a particular focus on the dynamics of invasive non-native species and their effects on biodiversity and ecosystems. She's also chair of a cost action network, Alien CSI, that's Citizen Science Investigate, which aims to increase the understanding of alien species through citizen science and involves more than 30 countries. So today, Helen is going to discuss how recent advances in methods and practices have enabled a better understanding of biological invasions and ultimately inform our decision-making on a biosecurity basis. So today's talk is entitled Unravelling the Ecology of Invasive Non-Native Species. So Professor Helen Roy.
Thank you very much. I think I've switched the microphone on. Is it working fine? Yes, good. So it's an absolute pleasure to be here with you all today and in this really fine room in the Linnean Society. So thank you so much for inviting me to be part of your lunchtime seminar series. So my talk involves many people, and some of the studies, in fact, one of the studies I'm going to talk to you about had about 147 people collaborating in that research. So although my name is the name against this talk, it does involve many people who I would like to acknowledge and thank, and this is just a few of them from the last year. So I'm in the Biological Record Centre, which is part of the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and it's really a very great privilege to be leading zoology within the Biological Record Centre. So the Biological Record Centre, or BRC, was established in the 1960s in recognition of this amazing legacy we have in the UK of recording wildlife. And there's nowhere quite like it in the world. And in some places, they'll be recording butterflies and birds, maybe plants. But here, we're recording so many different plants and animals. And it's really fantastic to have the role of head of zoology within the Biological Record Centre, where I get to work with many volunteers. I also happen to be the volunteer scheme organiser for the ladybird survey. So when I start to talk about ladybirds, I will stray, and I do apologise. And I'll walk out the room if I go on for too long, or give me some signal, but I do have quite a passion for ladybirds. And I just thought I'd mention that in celebration of 50 years of the Biological Record Centre, we published a special issue with Editor-in-Chief John Allen of the Biological Journal of the Linnean Society. And if anyone's interested in receiving a copy, if you don't already have one, then I'd be very happy to send you one. But we were really grateful to the Linnean Society for helping us to celebrate 50 years of the Biological Record Centre. So we're all hearing about very depressing declines in biodiversity worldwide. A few months ago, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services published the Global Assessment of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services and gave some really strong headline figures of the way in which biodiversity is suffering all over the world. And that biodiversity has such important role for us in terms of the ecosystem function that it provides. And so, of course, that's extremely worrying. Just last week, maybe you saw in the news or you took a look at the recent State of Nature report that was published by a huge consortium of people, led primarily by the RSPB through the National Biodiversity Network. And again, some quite depressing figures. Although if you delve deeply into it, you can see it's not all doom and gloom, and there are definitely some signs of optimism with some of the conservation programs that are really leading to some populations of plants and animals that were struggling beginning to thrive one more time. But there's no doubt we can't really hide from the quite depressing figures that we're seeing through a variety of publications. And when we begin to think about these drivers of decline, obviously climate change is one of the headline factors that is changing the world in which we live and changing that world for the wildlife that many of us love and we all rely on. But when we look at these different drivers of change, we can also see that invasive non-native species are one of the key drivers of change as well. And both in the State of Nature report, which this infographic to the side here is showing, highlights the role of invasive non-native species in these declines, but also this IPBES, this intergovernmental report, also shows that invasive alien or invasive non-native species are a big driver of change. But it also highlights the way in which these drivers of change interact with one another. So climate change will have an effect on invasive non-native species, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. I think it's really important to begin such a talk with some definitions. And non-native or alien species, and the two terms are pretty much interchangeable, are species that have been introduced from one part of the world to another part of the world where they didn't previously occur by humans. And this part in which the human involvement is really important in this definition. So when we're talking about non-native species, we're not talking about those species that have expanded their range through climate warming, for instance, which also maybe could go on to cause some problems, but might not. But the non-native species are the ones that have been introduced by humans in one way or another. So this here is the bryony ladybird. This is a species that arrived in the mid-1990s, and it was found, first of all, in a back garden in Surrey. And it feeds on white bryony. I was out looking for it yesterday in a churchyard because I'd heard of a recent sighting of it. It's had a really slow spread. I mean, it's been here for more than 20 years, and this is pretty much an accurate depiction of its distribution, all centered around here. Very, very slow spread, only feeding on white bryony. For people like me, and maybe people like you as well, it's a real pleasure to see it. It's quite a large, hairy ladybird. Of no concern whatsoever, a welcome addition to our fauna. But it was introduced in some way or other by humans. That's how it's here. In contrast, when we think about invasive non-native species, this is a subset of the non-native species that cause some kind of problem, either to biodiversity, to ecosystems, to our economies, or to society. And the harlequin ladybird, in contrast to the bryony ladybird, has a really wide diet. It's a predator, a top predator, feeds on many different insects, not just the pest insects for which it was introduced by humans as a biological control agent. And the animation on the side of the slides is showing the spread of this species, which was first recorded in 2004 and spread at 100 kilometers per year across the UK. Something's very much limiting its spread in Scotland, but it is making slow progress into Scotland as well. But we would term the harlequin ladybird, or Harmonia axyridis, an invasive non-native species because of the threat it poses to biodiversity and indeed potentially to ecosystem function. So we have been running, since the harlequin ladybird arrived, we knew that there was nothing that we could do about it. There was no control strategy that could be implemented that wouldn't affect other species as well, and indeed would not have eradicated the harlequin ladybird. But we did have an opportunity to get people involved in recording and tracking the spread of this particular non-native species. And so that's what we did. And we were able to use the data that we accrued through tracking the spread of the harlequin ladybird, but also because people were sending in records of other ladybird species as well, to begin to do some correlative studies to look at whether or not the harlequin ladybird was having any visible effect on other species of ladybird. And it is one of the depressing stories that adds to the depressing stories of biodiversity lately. But on this panel to the side, and I'm sort of favouring leaning over here, but I'll go to the other side as well at some point. There's 8 panels here, and each one is for a different ladybird species. There's a red line and also the black line because we use data from Belgium as well. But let's focus just on the black line. And what you can see for this for the Adalia bipunctata, for instance, which is this first panel, that's the two-spot ladybird, which in my childhood was a widespread and very common ladybird. But what we're seeing is that when it occurs with harlequin ladybirds, it shows a really steep decline, about 44% decline in two-spot ladybird distribution following the arrival of the harlequin ladybird. The harlequin ladybird eats two-spot ladybirds. Two-spot ladybirds are very poorly defended from being eaten by other ladybirds. And the harlequin ladybird also favors the habitats that the two-spot ladybird favors. It favors other habitats as well, but it thrives particularly well on deciduous trees. It's a very, very good competitor as well. So this tiny, poorly defended two-spot ladybird is just struggling with the arrival of the harlequin ladybird. But actually, when we look at a whole variety of other ladybird species, which all have very different kind of life histories, all of them, other than our common seven-spot ladybird, are struggling in the presence of the harlequin ladybird. So just as another example, this is the orange ladybird. This is a mildew-feeding ladybird. So it's not a competitor with the harlequin ladybird. But because it's a mildew-feeding ladybird, its development is quite slow. So it's at a larval stage, a sort of fleshy, maggoty stage, at a time when harlequin ladybirds don't have a lot to eat. So about now, you could find orange ladybird larvae, and unfortunately so can the harlequin ladybirds find them. And we think they're directly predating on them as well and contributing to some declines. So that was just to give some examples around some definitions of non-native species and highlight some of the problem that an invasive non-native species can cause. But we also do a lot of work for DEFRA in terms of compiling information on all of the non-native species in Britain. So we have a big database with lots and lots of information, and every year we produce a scorecard sort of showing the state of where we are with non-native species in Britain. We have about 2,000 species in Britain that are non-native and established. That is, that they have reproducing populations. There's about another 1,000 species that we don't have any evidence that they're actually reproducing here at the moment, but nevertheless they have been recorded. The database is dominated by plants, about 1,500 or more plants. But if we then begin to look at the invasive species within that, so those that are causing a problem, we can see that's a very low proportion of plants, about 6.7% of established non-native plants cause some kind of problem, whereas more than a third of the animals cause some kind of problem. So we have these databases full of lots of information on non-native species that we keep up to date. And every year we provide what's called the Biodiversity Indicator for DEFRA. So we tell them in graphical form what the current state is with respect to non-native species in freshwater, marine and terrestrial environments. And we show them a figure where it's just increasing year on year. So we're getting about 10 new species arriving every year. But it's all very well providing these graphs and documenting these invasions, which we can also do from a global perspective as well. So we compiled information from all around the world, and we can show that over time there's an increase in the number of first records, and there doesn't seem to be any sign of slowing. We can also see that 25% of all of the new species don't have an invasion history somewhere else before. So there's this huge pool of species which kind of slightly take us by surprise. So it's really quite challenging in terms of thinking about action that we can take. But I think we've definitely been very good at documenting invasions, and now what we need to do is get better at making some predictions. Because we know that in terms of action, preventing new arrivals coming in the first place is the most cost-effective and indeed generally effective way to deal with invasions. If a species does arrive that is likely to be problematic, the next best thing would be to contain it and prevent its spread. And then after that, it's kind of moving into long-term either eradication or long-term containment plans. So if there are ways in which we can introduce better biosecurity to prevent arrival in the first place, that has to be a really good thing to do. So we've been thinking hard about how can we make some predictions about what are the next species that could arrive and have some kind of impact. So back in 2012, we developed a method where we used expert elicitation, because we know we've got lots of knowledge gaps. We know 25% of these species don't have an invasion history elsewhere. So by gathering the best available information that's out there in the peer-reviewed literature and in databases, but also working with experts to fill in some of those gaps using kind of parallels with closely related other species, for instance, we were able to develop this horizon scanning approach, which sort of has two phases. One where we gather lots and lots of information across marine, terrestrial, and freshwater species, and then we bring it all together by having a workshop, by bringing big groups of experts together to discuss the lists of species that we come up with and think about ways in which we can rank them and get an understanding of one species in a marine environment, how does it compare to a species in a terrestrial environment, for instance. And in that way, we can come up with some ranked lists of species that we are concerned about, and from that, we can then take some appropriate action. So we carried out this process back in 2012 in Britain, and it went extremely well. We had various people there from government departments and practitioners so they could see how the process worked, and essentially we could just hand a list over to them at the end of the workshop for them to do as they will with that evidence. So we were then given some funding from the European Commission to carry out the same horizon scanning technique for the whole of the EU, which of course presents new and different challenges because there's different biogeographic zones and a lot more information to trawl through to think about probability of a species arriving, whether it's likely to establish, and then what kind of impact it might have once it is there. And then 2 years ago, we received funding from the UK government to carry out the same exercise for all of the UK overseas territories, of which there are 16 spread out around the world. And I thought I'd just tell you a little bit about some of the findings from that work. So we've published the papers for Britain, the list for Britain and also for Europe with Global Change Biology. And in Britain, straight away, there was some action, for instance, around the Asian hornet, Vesper valentina, which was one of our top 10 species that we identified back in 2012. And I'll talk a little bit more about that species in a moment. And then with the European Union, it's been very much about guiding and prioritizing species for very detailed risk assessments, so that then if the species is after going through a very lengthy risk assessment process, lengthy in terms of a big document rather than in time, then it can be listed as a species of concern for which certain action has to be taken by all member states. So this was one of our top 10 species that we highlighted for Britain. I will say it wasn't particularly rocket science to put Vesper valentina in the top 10 list. It was already in France, so that was quite an easy one in terms of it didn't have very far to come. It had been a really random arrival in France. It appeared in a pottery consignment, a mated female, and spread very rapidly from there. It feeds on a whole variety of different insects, and the concern is that it feeds on pollinating insects and particular honeybees, and so is considered to be an invasive non-native species. So we, working with DEFRA and the Non-Native Species Secretariat, set up an alert system for the Asian hornet and began to really raise awareness with beekeepers, but also with the general public to be on the lookout for this particular hornet. We've done a lot of work with the media, a lot of talks, and various activities. And what you can see here on this graph over time, and it's cut off my legend, I'm sorry about that, but this is 2018 data of numbers of reports we're getting of people thinking they've seen Vesper valentina. We've now had about 8,000 suspected sightings, but we've only had about 15 actual sightings of the Asian hornet. I think it's fantastic that we're able to pull out that very low number of actual sightings amongst that huge number of other reports, but it is extremely time-consuming to go through all of those reports. But on the whole, I'm just delighted that there is that awareness and people are engaging with monitoring Hornets, as it happens, more than Asian hornets. And one of the things we have is an Asian Hornet Watch app, but people can also record through various other online systems, and some people also send in emails. And what it's meant is that the system that we have is tied in closely with people who can actually take action on the ground, getting the reports very rapidly. So there was the first sighting of the Asian hornet in Gloucestershire in 2016. The nest was found and eradicated. We just had a sighting about 2 weeks ago. It has been eradicated. So at the moment, the system is working in that as soon as we get a record, the information is fired out to the necessary people. And because these hornets go back to their nest at night, it's fairly easy to destroy the nest. So we've had a few new records this autumn, but it's a very stable position, about the same number each autumn of records. So I've already mentioned that with the European Union, the long list that we developed for them, we're now working our way through some risk assessments so that then the species can be prioritised. And I'm not expecting you to read this, but it's essentially a very long list of species that are now listed within the EU regulation and are considered of concern and for which there is some recommended action that member states have to take. And we've also worked with the European Commission not only to come up with this list, but also to think about what can we think of as robust evidence in terms of a species then being listed? What should a risk assessment contain? And to be sort of the minimum standards for a species then being listed. And so that gives us opportunities as invasion ecologists to think about things like climate change, to think about impacts on ecosystem services, and to really be very comprehensive in assessing these different species. So I also mentioned the horizon scanning that we've been doing, carrying out exactly the same method around all of the overseas territories, except for we extended it to consider not only biodiversity ecosystems, but also human health and also economies. And for me, it was a really great pleasure and privilege to work with so many people from around the world who are in often quite remote territories and where they're safeguarding many endemic species. So we first of all carried out the work. We have a Darwin Initiative project with the Cyprus sovereign base areas. And this is the Akrotiri salt marsh, a really, really beautiful and important wetland area. And we've been working through Darwin funding for 2.5 years now, setting up a portal, a database for non-native species for Cyprus, and also beginning to put in place some of the awareness raising and citizen science initiatives that we've been using elsewhere. And we've published the lists that we derived for Cyprus through the horizon scanning, these predictions. So this is Grand Cayman, where we went and carried out the workshops for all of the overseas territories in the Caribbean for the UK. And when I think, this is my first trip to the Caribbean, and when I think of the Caribbean, I think of kind of luxury holidays and the like. And it certainly is a very beautiful place, but it literally rained torrentially every day. So I just wanted to say that to take away any illusion that I was having a wonderful holiday in Grand Cayman. I mean, it was wonderful. We had a great time, but it certainly rained. And they've certainly got huge problems already with invasive non-native species. So underneath this car here is a little, it seems little, actually they can get quite big, a green iguana. And this is an introduced species to Grand Cayman. There's 1 million iguanas, green iguanas, on Grand Cayman now. And in a good year, they'll double their population. In a poor year, they increase by 60%. And they it's almost not an exaggeration to say you can kind of trip over the green iguanas on Grand Cayman. But perhaps more worrying is they're beginning to encroach on the territory of blue iguanas, which are an endemic species to the Cayman Islands and have been part of a huge conservation action, really successful in terms of captive breeding and reintroduction to bolster the populations that were massively in decline. So it's really concerning how something like the green iguana could cause problems in this very beautiful place. But also this is to highlight, they have this seaweed problem as well, with this introduced seaweed just forming and piling up on the beaches. And from an economic perspective and a tourism perspective, this is very tricky when literally the beach is absolutely covered in a pile of seaweed which begins to rot quite rapidly. St. Halina was an absolutely magical place to visit. It was a good job it was so magical. We got stranded there for 6 days because the airplane couldn't get back to get us off. But it was an incredible place to be, and I very much hope to go back some other time. But we met with people on St. Helena from the National Trust and from the biosecurity teams and carried out the same exercise there. And what you can see here is New Zealand flax, which again, an introduced species covering large areas of what would have been native cloud forest within St. Helena. And they have the most amazing invertebrate fauna there. So they have about 400 or more endemic species of invertebrate, a really, really special place. And New Zealand flax is causing no end of problems there. So our work was to try and think about the species that we could prevent arriving and causing problems going forward. And it does feel like I'm showing my holiday photos, but we did work very hard in these places. We also went to the Indian Ocean to work within the Indian Ocean Territory, doing exactly the same exercise. And again, a great privilege to work with people on the ground there who are doing so much to conserve this very special place. So having done this listing for all of the 16 overseas territories, when we look at the whole list, we can see that there are some species which will be a problem everywhere, regardless of whether it's in the South Atlantic or in the Caribbean. And things such as a green mussel, Perna viridis, which can be carried so easily on the hull of a ship from one place to another, could really cause quite a lot of problems to communities within marine environments. Ants feature very high on the list, as do mosquitoes as well. So perhaps no particular surprises, but hopefully now some action can be put in place to try and prevent the arrival of some of these damaging species to these amazing places. And the way in which we go about that is we look at the pathways of arrival. And I'm sorry this is such a cluttered diagram, but essentially these are all different ways in which species can arrive. And these are sort of the high-level ways, and these are broken down into more specific ways, such as horticulture and ornamental, contamination of animals, food, etc. And we can begin then to see what are the major ways in which species could be arriving, and what can these overseas territories do to prevent the arrival, what kind of pathway action management can be put in place to prevent arrival in the first place. And we've been doing some action planning with the overseas territories who actually have quite amazing biosecurity already in many places. So this is in St. Helena. When we were stranded, we said, is there anything we can do that would be helpful? And they said, will you come and help us sort through all the fruit that's just arriving onto the island and needs to be all checked before it gets distributed across the island. So we had a great afternoon. I'm not sure how helpful we were or whether people were very polite to us, but anyway, it was great for us, and we enjoyed the conversations we had with people in the biosecurity team and saw their great work. So hopefully I've highlighted through my talk the importance of global collaborations, the importance of sharing information between countries. And I think this is probably the case in all of science, of course, but it's particularly the case when these species are moving from one place to another, and we need for early warning to share that kind of intelligence of where species are cropping up and causing problems, so we can perhaps prevent spread on a global scale. I think it's really important to gauge people, to get people's understanding around some of these issues, and in terms of then addressing some of the biodiversity declines that we're experiencing. I do have huge optimism that we can do something, we can make a difference. And these are some people doing some flower insect time counts in Cyprus, where we've been putting together pollinator monitoring schemes for Cypriot residents. And also the importance of moving away from just documenting declines and documenting the effects of environmental change, and really beginning to make some predictions and to implement some practical action and measures, so we can start to move from what seems to be quite bleak and depressing within the biodiversity world at times to thinking much more in terms of optimism and solutions. So I just thought I'd finish by mentioning our iRecord system. If you're not already recording wildlife, you could get involved through iRecord, and the app works really well if you have a smartphone for recording. And of course, the survey that's very dear to my heart, the ladybird survey. Please do send in all your sightings of ladybirds, and particularly this time of year, as you'll start to see them moving into their overwintering locations. They're very obvious and apparent at the moment. So thank you to the Linnean Society for inviting me here today, and thank you all for listening, and thank you to many, many people who've been involved in this work.